Hello, my name is Cecily Spall and I work for FAS Heritage. Between 1993 and 2007, we ran the Tarbat Discovery Programme jointly with the University of York. Through survey and open area excavation, the project explored the 8th century Pictish monastic settlement which lay around and beneath the Church of St Colman in Portmahomack, East of Ross. The results of the 20-year research programme also identified a 5th to 7th century Pictish estate, an early 9th century Viking raid on the monastery, a 9th century Scoto-North trading farm, and a later medieval settlement of the 13th to 16th centuries. The results of the research programme were brought to publication in 2016 and are now freely available online. It's the last phase of late medieval activity, which is now the subject of new research. And this archaeology represents some of the most important late medieval archaeology in the Scottish Highlands. The Tarbat Medieval Burials Project began in 2019, funded by Historic Environment Scotland and the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. The project aims to use archaeological science to better understand the late medieval population from Portmahomack, and in particular a group of highly unusual burials. It's being undertaken in partnership with the Tarbat Historic Trust, who own and operate the Tarbat Discovery Centre in Portmahomack. An important aspect of the project is the outreach programme, which aims to widen the audience for the centre. The Great Age, for which Portmahomack is currently best known, and for good reason, began when the 5th to 7th century Pictish farm estate was gifted to the founding of a monastery in the 8th century. The monks soon began carving beautiful memorials in stone and making jewelled gold and silver chalices and patens to celebrate Mass and found other monasteries. They were also making vellum for holy books, which would probably have rivalled those, such as the Book of Kells, in their quality and artistry. The monastery was raided in the early 9th century, and although activity resumed briefly, the site was no longer occupied by the 11th century. Nevertheless, the current project indicates that the later medieval inhabitants of Portmahomack had a significant awareness of this early Christian place, and the presence of the monastery seems to have remained an influence on religious practice into the late medieval period. The Tarbat Medieval Burials Project is now the focus of the research programme, and is designed to use archaeological science to look in detail at the people of Portmahomack who were buried in St Colman's Church during the 13th to 16th century. A total of 88 medieval burials of men, women and children were interred in the nave of the church during these centuries. Not only do we have these burials, the excavation outside the church also made contact with areas where these people lived, farmed and built workshops, and this has also shed light on their lives as well as their deaths. The onset of later medieval activity was marked by the building of a stone church in the by then abandoned monastic cemetery. Outside the church, evidence for housing, fishing and craft working was found. Finds, which arrived as manuring of fields under ridge and furrow cultivation, consisted of a small group of coins post-dating 1250 and a larger group of Scottish redware pottery broadly dated to the 13th to 15th century. By the mid-14th century, a community had grown up who farmed the land, raised livestock and fished the lochs and the sea. The coin use profile for the site indicates a significant drop-off in activity between 1350 and 1450, when no contemporary coins appear to have been circulating. Sometime during the 14th century, the church was enlarged at both ends, creating a bigger nave, and a crypt was also added. The church became the focus of increased and significant investment. The east end was host to this significant crypt, with an aumbry or stone niche, probably hosting the relics of a saint. Coin use from 1450 began to pick up again, with base metal Scottish pennies of the 15th and 16th century circulating in greater numbers. During this time, a great ironworks grew up outside the church, associated with huge quantities of ironworking slags. During this period, burial inside the church became much more common, perhaps very sought after. With a few exceptions, the burials were oriented west-east. They were sometimes buried shrouded, sometimes in a coffin, sometimes including both and sometimes including neither. Older men were the most likely to be buried in a coffin, and indeed a group of males in coffins jostled for the best positions in the nave at the mouth of the crypt, perhaps as close to the saints' relics as was possible. It's some of these burials in particular that now form the focus of our attention, and most especially the central burial at the entrance to the crypt, which we have come to know as the burial with the 6 heads. Our initial interpretation focused on the possibility that the burial was related to adversarial relationships, but further analysis was clearly required. This remarkable burial requires some careful description. This large, centrally positioned grave was dug to receive a large wooden oak coffin containing the body of a mature man who had died sometime between his 45th and 60th year. He had been killed during a violent fight which involved large bladed weapons. His injuries included a blow to the left temple, which may have stunned him briefly, and was followed by a second blow across his right cheek, which probably severed his jaw from his face. This last wound was clearly not a survivable injury. You can see in this colour scan the loss of the lower part of the man's skull and top teeth as it was removed by the blade. In life, he had been the tallest man in the medieval population, standing at 1.8 metres, or about 6 foot tall, which was well above average. Osteological analysis, undertaken by Dr. Shirley Curtis Summers of the University of Bradford, indicated a range of conditions including degenerative joint disease and osteoarthritis, and also suggested that he may have been a seasoned fighter. On his death, the man was buried in a large oak coffin. If you look closely at this photograph, you can see the thin brown line in the sand indicating the shape of the coffin. Into the coffin, 4 extra skulls were set surrounding his head, as well as extra lower leg bones. Osteological analysis of the 4 skulls indicates that they belong to a man aged 46 to 59 years, a man aged 26 to 35 years, a woman aged 18 to 25, and a man also aged 18 to 25. The digging of this grave did not directly displace any earlier burials, and so understanding the origin and curation of these skulls derived from some other graves is a principal question in the current project. Or, to put it another way, are they the skulls of vanquished adversaries, or are they the skulls of ancestors? As if the burial of this man wasn't remarkable enough, after a time, perhaps a generation or so, the grave was reopened, the coffin lid removed, and the body of a second male placed within, overlying the first. This act involved the removal of the first man's skull, which was placed at the foot of the grave. The second body placed in the grave was that of a middle-aged man, aged 36 to 45 years. He was the second tallest man in the population, at 1.76 metres in height. There are no signs on this man's skeleton of how or why he died, no injuries or signs of disease. His skull was so well preserved that he was suitable for facial reconstruction. This process begins by scanning the skull and jaw in 3D, which was undertaken for us very generously by Visualising Heritage at the University of Bradford. This digital image then formed the basis of a computer-based reconstruction, which was funded generously by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. The facial reconstruction was undertaken by specialists at FAS Lab at Liverpool John Moore University. The team had access to a European database of average tissue depth measurements, and they used these data to rebuild the likely appearance over the scan of the skull. The scientific programme, which has been designed to better understand these remarkable burials, includes radiocarbon dating on both the full burials and the 4 accompanying skulls. Statistical modelling has been undertaken to try and pin down as accurate a date bracket for the burials as possible. Multi-isotope analysis of strontium and oxygen, and carbon and nitrogen has been undertaken to gain insight into possible local or non-local origins of the individuals and to understand their diet better. Ancient DNA analysis is also underway to provide information on any family connections, ancestral connections and physical appearance. Radiocarbon dating, marine correction and statistical modelling has been undertaken for us by the Scottish University's Environmental Research Centre. The results tell us that the first man died between AD 1290 and 1410, while the scumpanies which accompanied his burial break into two groups. A single skull returned a date of AD 770 to 945, and the three remaining skulls return very similar dates between AD 1250 and AD 1400, appearing broadly contemporary. They may have died slightly earlier than the first burial, which accords with the archaeological evidence. The second man to occupy the grave died between AD 1335 and 1450. The dates of the accompanying skulls would be consistent perhaps with them belonging to a preceding generation, while the date of the second burial could conceivably place a generation later. If so, these dates could be indicating that there may be an ancestral emphasis on the selection of the skulls and the sequence of burials. The single early medieval skull dating to the 8th to 10th century may well be a carefully selected addition to the group and may have been seen as a Christian relic. We've submitted samples from both burials and the four skulls to Harvard University, who are kindly undertaking ancient DNA analysis for us in kind. The results are pending. Initial processing of the samples has indicated that preservation is good and that it will be possible to detect family relationships and shared ancestry. In addition, it will also be possible to identify the likely skin tone and hair and eye colour of individuals, which will allow the facial reconstruction to be altered accordingly. As well as the C14 dating and ancient DNA analysis, multi-isotope analysis has also been undertaken, again by Suark. Strontium and oxygen stable isotope analysis indicates that the first burial and the three contemporary skulls were all likely to have been born and raised locally, perhaps on the Tarbat Peninsula. Interestingly, the values of the second burial indicate he was not born locally, but moved here during childhood, perhaps from the west of Scotland or the Northern Isles. While the full results of the ancient DNA are still pending, it's wise to be cautious in our interpretation of the results so far. The radiocarbon dating, along with the archaeological evidence, suggests that the four skulls were perhaps selected quite carefully. Three predate the first burial, perhaps by a generation, and the fourth is that of a Pictish monk, also likely to have been carefully selected. The stable isotope analysis suggests that, unlike the other individuals, the second burial grew up some way away from the Tarbat Peninsula and could be signalling wider social changes. So, what circumstances could have prompted such extraordinary and unorthodox burial choices in a Christian community? Why would a community need to try to invoke the intercession of both ancestors, represented by the three skulls, and the holy man, represented by the Pictish monk relic? The violent death of the first man is likely to have been highly distressing to this community and clearly signals the presence of unsettling social stresses. Added to which, the period during which these people lived and died, that is, broadly speaking, the 14th century, was characterised by significant natural or environmental events, which resulted in a sometimes very precarious existence. Their way of life relied on subsistence farming of the land, rearing livestock and fishing the sea. The balance of this way of life could be easily upset by factors such as seasonal climatic variation causing famine for human and animals, as well as disease. The Tarbat Peninsula is a fertile and well-connected parcel of land and an area worth fighting for. The Great European Famine of 1315 to 1322 was accompanied by significant livestock plagues. these are likely to have compounded an already difficult existence affecting young and old alike. 25 years or a generation later, the onset of 3 waves of the Black Death from the 1350s through to the 1390s punctuate the period during which these people grew up and died. Perhaps the distress which these extraordinary burials seem to embody is a reflection of how difficult life was during the long 14th century. The research programme continues, and we will continue to publicise the results as we get them. For now, I will leave you with information on how to access the research monograph, which details this fascinating late medieval period at Portmahomack in greater detail. Thank you for listening.